Hey friends, welcome to Ask Dr. Betters. I'm Danielle and I'm here with my granddad, Dr. Chuck F. Betters. Granddad, the question we have for you today is how do I find resources to help me with my grief?
Wow, you've come to the right place with that question. Mark Inc. Ministries exists for the very purpose of providing resources for hurting people. If you visit us at markinc.org, we have a whole page that is designated for people who are going through grief. And I want to encourage you to check out all the resources that we have available because grief comes in various shapes and sizes and forms. There's a whole slew of ways in which people grieve over whatever loss they are experiencing. Having given you that resource, I want to take you back a few years, actually over 30 years, to when we first experienced the life-changing moment when we discovered that our 16-year-old son, Mark, was killed in a tragic car accident. And friends, I gotta tell you, when you are in the throes of grief, you've got to be very careful who you surround yourself with, the people that you allow to influence your thinking. There are toxic people who can harm you, and there are beneficial people, edifying people who will know how to build you up. You need to surround yourself with people who aren't afraid to put on the surgeon's gown and walk into the operating room with you, to get bloodied, to get messed up. And you want to avoid being around people who think they are there to heal you, to figure out a way to make you feel better without thinking through some of the stuff that they might be saying. Now, I read every book I could get my hands on concerning grief. Many of them brought me up short. Some of them were extremely beneficial. I learned to take out of each resource something that I could apply to my own experience with this horrible enemy called grief. When you put them all together, all those resources, there were times when I was able to say, this doesn't make any sense. And other times when I thought, aha, there it is, that's what I'm missing. But you're not going to know that unless you dig into the resources. My starting point, of course, was scripture. Studying the life of Job, for example, and the suffering that he went through. Some of the things that he said just weren't me. I couldn't see myself ever saying those things. For example, Job says in the midst of his grief, though he slay me, yet will I trust him. I couldn't say that because I felt like God had already slain us and the pain was too unbearable. My wife and I were like two soldiers, bloodied soldiers, trying to drag each other off the battlefield. We had to surround ourselves with people who were ahead of us in the game, people who were down the road in their grief, who had walked the dark hallways of grief already years before. And we asked them to look back and help us walk through our own grief. Those people were tremendously valuable. I don't know how we would have survived without some of the things they had to say to us. We surrounded ourselves with people who were not afraid to talk about our son, to tell us a story about something that they remembered about him, something that he did that was ornery, or something that he did that was funny, or some way in which he helped somebody. something about his faith, or even his faithlessness. We wanted to hear those kinds of stories. And we wanted to be around people who were unafraid to tell us those stories. So I think it's important that you study to show yourself approved unto God, as Paul told his young protege Timothy. To study your situation. Study grief. Read whatever you can, good, bad, or indifferent, whether it's helpful or not, and look for that one nugget that you need at that moment. And you will find that over the course of time, those people, those beneficial people, that beneficial book, that scripture verse, that one story will get you through one more day, 2 more days, 3 more days, as you begin to heal in this long marathon, not a sprint, this marathon that we call grief. So to answer your question, Mark Inc. has valuable resources on grief. Look them up, read them, study them, watch them, learn, grow. They're all scripture-based. Surround yourself with godly people who have edifying speech. Pray that God would give you every day a new nugget of truth, a new vitamin for that day, a spiritual vitamin to jolt you out of the place where you find yourself tied down to the railroad tracks with a train coming at you 100 miles an hour, called grief. And find that relief by studying your situation. God will give you answers. God will give you resources. Some of them you may not even remember. One final thought. Keep a journal, especially during the early days of your grief. I kept one for about a year. And during that year, I would write down the harsh reality of grief and how God sustained me in that day. And then a year from then, or 2 years from then, I could go back and revisit what I wrote where God touched down, where God gave me on a particular day what I needed to be sustained just for that moment. You know what that does? That shows you the faithfulness of God. That God is holding us tightly in his grip when we feel that we were in a free fall, only to discover that God is sustaining us, holding us. That journal helps you as memorial stones, I like to call them, to touch base with over the course of time, to demonstrate the faithfulness of God. This has scriptural precedent, by the way. In the travels of Israel, God oftentimes told them, stop here, build an altar. And they would gather memorial stones and build an altar so that God could bring them back to that place again and again to remind him how he drew water out of the rock, how he gave them manna from heaven, how he answered prayer in their desperation, how he sustained them in their fear and grief. Those memorial stones can be built every day if you keep a biblical journal. I hope these ideas help you. But sure enough, visit markinc.org. That's why this ministry exists, to provide you with resources from people who are ahead of you in the struggle. If you have a question you'd like me to consider, write it down in the comments section. Visit us at markinc.org and discover some of the greatest resources you'll ever have in facing your own grief. I hope this helps.